Welcome back, and we were speaking with Dr. Ehosa on writers, the uncelebrated drivers of African development. When we talk about looking at writers as the uncelebrated drivers of African development, what do we mean when we say that?
It's one of those funny things where you find yourself having to look at the how writers tell the history of a people, how well they speak to their own people's history. Because I caught only the second half of that sentence, so please do not mind me. But how well writers speak to their history, and you find that they become custodians of their people's story. And I've always believed that the way stories work, the way writers prop their people up, the way writers keep their people's history in front of them, becomes a thing of pride. It becomes a way of looking at the world that becomes invaluable to their people. So in essence, they become, like you said, custodian of their people's development, as in a manner of speaking.
Writers that we know who have written things that have shaped how Africa is seen. Why do you think that the historical role of writers when it comes to shaping African identity, particularly post-colonial African identity, is often under-acknowledged when it comes to when we have development conversations?
Is it though? Is it? Because maybe I'm blinded because I'm in the industry, but you remember that I have a unique point of view. I came from medicine. I came from the world of science, and writers were superstars even to us in the world. So most times there tends to be this idea where we cry foul and we look at the bad parts of things, but writers can be acknowledged as being really important and vital. Now, there's one problem that we always mistake, and that is the fact that there's no real gatekeeper to becoming a writer. It's one of those funny professions where many people are called. Many people are called. All you need is a laptop and Microsoft Word, and you can make yourself a writer. But in that situation, paradoxically, very few climb to those heights where they become cultural icons. And I think that is where the problem is, where most times the perception issue comes. And I think that's why you find that, look at me now, I'm on television on a Tuesday morning. Why? Because I left medicine and became a writer. Medicine will not have put me on TV. Now, that doesn't take away from the fact that it can be a very painful and empty and non-fulfilling space when the world decides that your story is not what they want to hear. It can be really brutal at times, but it comes with the space. If you decide that this is what you want to do, you have to also be ready to decide that nobody will want to listen to what you want to say. It's unfair at times, but it's just the reality of what the world is like. So I don't really fall into that thing. I believe that writers, and even from the publisher's point of view, our job is mostly to know in reality what the space is like before we get in there, tell our stories. Most of our problems come from more practical problems. Most of our issues come from more practical problems having to do with actually selling our stories to readers, I believe. Not so much as a societal attitudinal issue where the world doesn't care or the world is unfair to writers. It's there, yes, I can acknowledge it is there, but it's also there that maybe the world doesn't just want to listen to what you have to say. And you have to keep on shouting against a blank, solid white wall. But you don't stop regardless. That's not what you want to worry about as a writer. You just keep on telling your story, and eventually, if it's important, the world will listen.
All right, I get you, but also, do you think that that is the reason why it is underacknowledged? Because earlier on, when I introduced the topic, I made mention of when you talk about when we talk about African development, the most of the spotlight is being given to politicians, economists, and people in that
Ah,
position. But when it comes to writers, it's as if it is dropped down a bit. People don't really recognize the role that writers play. So that is what I'm asking when I mean when writers are under acknowledged when it comes to their contribution to African development.
and I know I got that. We're having sound difficulties at that time, but I'm also trying to complicate that by saying that by its very nature, it's almost inevitable that writers will be under-acknowledged, that even publishing and the entire trade industry will be under-acknowledged, especially when the medium of our expression is being uh, fought over, is being contested by print and by other forms of media. I'm acknowledging that and complicating it by saying that it can also be expected. And that's what I'm trying to say. I'm actually acknowledging it and saying that yes, it is to be expected at times. It can seem unfair, but the world's attention is more usually drawn by things that they see in front of them. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not enough to cry foul. You can also move on and say, yeah, that's what's expected. Even in the US, even in other countries, um, well, human beings tend to forget much more serious people. That's what I'm trying
Oh,
to say.
oh, all right. Now, when we talk about African development, of course, looking at it holistically, we look at both the colonial period, post-colonial, up until this moment, and we know that most African writers use their form of art as a medium of resistance. So, how would you say that that has influenced nation building in Africa, influenced when it comes to decolonization and also nation building to where we are now in Africa? How has writing influenced that?
Well, I think then we go back to the idea, like I said, writers are a custodian of their people's history. There's this thing that I used to say when we would have these conversations about writing and about agenda writing. There's this idea that agenda writing is really bad, especially when you put the agenda first instead of putting the talent first. You have to remember that writers, first of all, are entertainers. The entire point of writing is to entertain, and by entertain, I mean to stimulate both emotion, to stimulate an emotional and intellectual response in your reader. And if you miss that, then the entire point is gone. So one of the first focuses that we always have is that you must entertain your reader and trick them into an education. That's the phrase, trick them into an education. So, like I've always said, if you notice from my conversations since we started speaking this morning, I tend to be a talent first kind of person. And in that sense, you find that the best writers, no matter how serious their stories were, no matter how you felt angry about them, one thing you always noticed was that they were actually really brilliant at what they did. It's kind of a thing that you notice with in our profession. So the first things first is, for example, Chino Achebe was had one of the wittiest prose style. If Chino Achebe wrote something that was funny, it was funny. If he wrote something that was really poignant and painful, it was poignant and painful. So in that sense, the writers had to be really good first. The same thing with Ngugi Wationgo, the writers that wrote around that period, they wrote in the immediate pre-colonial period, they're brilliant at what they did. And in that sense, they tricked their readers into an education. Imagine you are a community that for about since the 1890s, when British and even European imperialism reached its peak, and in two generations, by 1950 something, your people have been browbeaten. What what changed your minds? In what places did your storytellers hide their pain and anger, transmit it across the entire population? And what space did those writers then play in the immediate post-colonial period? In Nigeria, it was particularly painful because within 6 years of our independence, we were at war. Um, who kept the faith? Who kept on telling us our stories? Who took certain actions that even led to death and imprisonment? So, in that sense, writers have always been um, vital to a people's nation building. Writers have always been important. And what I keep on saying is that, in contrast to the perception, in certain important spaces, they are acknowledged as having taken those roles, acknowledged as having been in the forefront. Some of our most iconic public personalities have been writers. Even if Pensarua was a writer, even if their roles in our history were particularly controversial, Wale Soyinka is a writer, Chima Achebe is a writer, Sifrani Quincy, there's so many names, and Shaw, there are some people who came to the fore, been famous for their words. Now, in more recent years, as that changed, they are so beautiful. You guys, you got me perfectly. You actually just put up exactly what I needed, the pictures that I needed, exactly. And you find that the reason why these images are iconic is that paradoxically, they are acknowledged. So the filter might be, to complicate the original premise, the filter might be that it is difficult to become one of these icons. And it is very easy to become a writer. All you need is talent, and I said, and a pen. But does the world want to hear what you have to say?
All right, now we can't talk about Africa without talking about our oral traditions, which, of course, is Africa's first literary form before we, grew into writing it down on pen and paper. So now, in what ways would you say that modern African writers have incorporated these oral forms of literature into, contemporary writing, and use it as tools to make social and political commentary?
There's one thing I've always believed in my own, from my point of view as a writer, and that is that all that storytelling is an oral art form. AURAL, oral. It's something that you listen to, and it's also oral in the sense of ORAL, something that you voice. And any editor worth his salt will tell you to read your story aloud after writing it. No matter how beautiful the sentence looks on the page, if it doesn't sound well, if it doesn't sound the way you want it to sound, it is completely useless. So, in essence, even when it comes to poetry, I've always believed that poetry is the poetry itself is I believe that spoken word is the most perfect form of poetry. My friends tend to tease me that I'm dyslexic when it comes to poems, and because I can't see it on the page. Once I listen to it, I'm the person who is the biggest fan of what I'm seeing. So in that sense, what you find about the role of oral forms, of traditional forms of our art form, is that from time immemorial even till now, all writers who succeed recognize the connection between those forms of our own literature, of our own indigenous literature, and the written word. One of the biggest insight that any writer eventually earns or gets is the idea that the written word is different language from what you hear. And the best thing you can do, the best skill you can develop, is how to transmit and speak in this new language. But remember, it is still language, which originally is an oral tool for communication between peoples. So you find that it has been the same. It hasn't changed. All writers who become good at this thing are aware of the connection between traditional literature, traditional art forms, for storytelling, for poetry, for even praise, for the way we have our indigenous naming conventions. In Benin, if I come to see my grandmother when she was alive, she would spend about what seemed like 5 minutes, but was probably shorter, calling my name. And it wasn't just the name that you see, Dr. Egosa Imaswem. It was a long sentence, an essay, a series of repetitions, and it was beautiful when she sang it in Benin. And I know that the Igbos have that, the Yorubas have that. And I believe that some of the best people, when you see that in a different form, either in poetry or in prose, it is connected to our entire history. All writers are aware of this. and they keep up the form. Even when they are not aware, they inadvertently keep that connection going.
All right, but we're also, seeing a decline when it comes to passing on these oral traditions, and when, particularly to the younger generation. So we find that some of the very important parts of our tradition is being lost with time. Now, do you think that as the years go by, this could influence, writing, when most of these things are lost and the new generation of writers do not have access to these things, and so cannot, convert it into their prose or their poetry or drama?
Um, yeah, this is where I can be really cynical and agree with you, and also tragically acknowledge the inevitability of this thing. Um, we lost the battle 120 years ago, and we kept a rearguard action. And my voice gets emotional when I think about it. We fought a rearguard action, trying to protect our oral histories from an onslaught by unified media from other parts of the world. We fought really bravely. And tragically, what I see happening, or it might not be that tragic, what I see happening is that a new version of tradition might eventually develop. The oral histories will remain, and there will be children who will learn it, and we wish that they succeed in having to eventually spread it. Um, I'm so sad. I'm so saddened by what you pointed out, but I also fear that it might be. It's something that a friend of mine who lives and works in Enugu teases me about. Mr. James says, he says, because you're too cynical, and besides, people think you are one of the most forward-looking people in the world. I said, but I have to look forward because looking back is so painful. But even then, even in this situation, I hope I'm able to transmit to you the importance of maintaining those histories, of maintaining those storytelling styles, even if it takes one more child to take it to the next generation, that is enough, because that child becomes a custodian of that skill, of that art form. And with the skill of, and with the idea that modern media can actually completely extrapolate and explode something, all that person needs is a phone and a social media account. And before you know, even if it seems as though nobody is listening, somebody is catching on that art form. So what I'm trying to speak to is that the fear that we have about these things might not be as massive as we think it is what I'm trying to say.
So now that we have pointed this out, what would you say would be the most effective solution to this, so that we don't lose everything out at the end of the day when it comes to telling our story as Africans?
All right, I think I already did that. The democratization of media. As a television station, you know what you're fighting against. Everybody with a mobile phone and a TikTok account is a broadcaster. Paradoxically, that breaking of chains, that removing of gatekeepers that we fear even as publishers, means that people are able to go straight and take us out as middlemen, while acknowledging how revenue loss driven that might be. It also shows that the stories will spread. The what's her name? Pandora has already opened that box, and it is gone for about 20 years now. We both know its effects, both good and bad, of things like social media, or things like the ability for every individual to become a broadcaster by themselves. There's a multiplicity of stories out there. Even when we complain about it being unstructured, in that craziness, there are discoveries being made of new talent every day. I can't claim to be a gatekeeper as a publisher, as a writer. I marvel at some of the things I read in some of the weirdest places, in some of the weirdest blogs, even in something as simple as scrolling stories on Instagram. You just see people putting passages out there. That is where the crucible is. That is where the cultivation will occur. So in essence, while we fear it, while we perceive these things as becoming really bad, trust me, somewhere out there there's a young person who learned a story from their grandmom, who wonders why nobody in their school knows it, and who opens a social media account and just tells it, and the person becomes a star. Now, the tragedy is that there's also a lot of noise and really, really bad stuff and you are fighting in the market of ideas without gatekeepers, without people being able to tell which is good and which is bad. But I fear not. I say to everybody, speak. Um, you never know what will come out of that space, is what I say.
All right. Now we've seen we know that literature obviously is one major tool to when it comes to challenge, some negative things that happen in society, negative and positive actually. And we've also seen situations where writers, popular writers like you mentioned, Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Wole Soyinka and the likes of them being jailed or exiled for their words and their writings and the way they challenged certain things that were unacceptable in society. Now, why do you think that some political powers see writers as threats, and what do you think that suggests about their potential to influence social change?
Mm, I don't know. It's self-evident that people fear those who have actual power, and there's nothing as painful as being insulted in really well-crafted prose by a brilliant writer. So I just think that times it can be less economical than we think. It can just be that the big man is just annoyed and has the power to mess up or destroy a writer, and they go for it because they think they have no power. And each time they do it, they always find out that more people listen to the writer than they think do. In that essence, I have nothing really special to say beyond what the most important thing from a writer's point of view, if I can end on this, is to keep their talent up, focus on telling their story, focus on telling their people's story, and the world will listen. I believe that that's the most important thing. The noise out there will always be there. Has always been, the writers have always had those issues, but the most important thing any writer can do is to keep true to their story, to listen to their heart and listen to their people and tell it. That is the most important thing.
All right, and one very worrisome thing too that has been noticed is that most people, particularly most young people, don't really appreciate reading culture as much. They would rather scroll through their phones on social media, watching videos and the likes, as opposed to picking up a book to actually read it and understand what it's about. Now, how would you say that has affected writing, and what can be done to bring up this interest again for reading culture?
It's one of the paradoxes that you cannot use a phone now without being literate. Have you noticed that? You can actually use a phone now. The burden of literacy has actually increased in the modern world. You have to be literate to use a mobile phone. You have to be able to read what is on the screen. So the issue most times is not that are people reading less. No, like you said, you specifically said books. Is what are they reading and how much attention spanning, how much attention demanding it is. So what we are having is an attention deficit, really. And which means that people are being trained by screens and other devices to have little time for long form. What you find is that there are other ways in which to engage text. One of the underproven ways is actually taking us back to the source and origin of books, which is audiobooks. You're finding people having much more ease to be able to survive in this multi-dimensional world by popping something into their ear, listening to a book while they walk. So our duty as publishers is to get the story to the people in whatever form that we can. And the skill of reading, the skill of holding your attention for a long time, just means that the books have to be available. One of the largest counterfeiting industries in Nigeria is book piracy. Those people in those markets, in the big markets in area or in Onisha or in Ajegunle, would not be investing billions in pirating books if there wasn't a market for them. So it's one of those paradoxes, like I said, while we understand and acknowledge the issues, we must always remember that all it takes is a critical mass of people who are reading to sustain an industry. And every individual, from parents, have a book in the house. Do not think that my children are not reading. Have a bookshelf. Stock it with books. Limit screen time if you have to. One child out of those kids will pick up a book, and that is all it takes. Do not turn it into a chore. Turn it into something to enjoy. For society itself, there's nothing you can do as a government or as a policymaker than make sure that publishers earn from what they do so that they can sustain the market. Tragedy with pirates is that pirates cannot sustain the market, they tend to destroy it. So it is in those little spaces, and of course, media like yourself, keep on ringing the bell, keep on shouting the alarm. Kids are not reading, people are not reading. But acknowledge where the points of intervention are. Then places like ensuring that publishers earn, two, ensuring that parents have books and they can put in the homes, ensuring that publishing does not get a Pavlovian connection to punishment. Reading does not get a Pavlovian connection to punishment so that the children therefore resent reading because they connected with the time the teacher flogged them. It must be something enjoyable. So in those libraries, something we haven't spoken about, library culture also is also vital. I grew up to meet libraries and I'm older now, and all I say, a few private efforts. The government libraries are completely empty. It's important that people understand that the things that don't seem important are important because the points of intervention are very few and very far between. And I think that, and they're really easy to itemize and really not expensive.
Yeah.
But
All right. Thank you
yeah,
so much, Dr. Ehosa, for this lovely conversation. I hope that, people continue to write, read, so that we can continue to share our stories and also improve ourselves as Africans. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, and I apologize for the technical glitches. It was a lovely morning speaking to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Save Nature TV. News in your pocket.